The medieval world. For many, the very words conjure images of a dark, unenlightened, and brutal age, a time of iron-fisted kings, of knights in clunky, cumbersome armor, and of a populace living in constant fear and ignorance. It's a picture painted by centuries of folklore, films, and even, at times, by history books themselves. But how much of this popular image is a grand misconception, a carefully constructed tapestry woven from threads of truth and fiction? Welcome to Medieval Nocturnes. In this series, we will gently peel back the layers of myth to reveal the fascinating and often surprising truths of the Middle Ages. If you enjoy delving into the quiet corners of history and challenging what you think you know, consider subscribing to our channel. We invite you to join us on this journey into the past, where the reality is far more compelling than the legend. Let's begin with one of the most pervasive myths of all, the belief that people in the Middle Ages thought the world was flat. We've all heard it, perhaps even been taught it in school. The story goes that Christopher Columbus was a lone genius, bravely sailing against the tide of ignorance, risking falling off the edge of the world to prove its roundness. It's a dramatic tale of scientific enlightenment, triumphing over medieval superstition. But the story is almost entirely false. The knowledge that the Earth was a sphere was not a revolutionary idea of the Renaissance. It was an established fact, understood and accepted by educated people for centuries. Long before the medieval period even began, the ancient Greeks, as early as the 6th century BC, had not only theorized, but had also provided observational evidence for a spherical Earth. Thinkers like Pythagoras, and later Aristotle, noted that ships disappeared hull first over the horizon, and that the Earth cast a circular shadow on the moon during a lunar eclipse. By the 3rd century BC, Eratosthenes had even calculated the Earth's circumference with remarkable accuracy. This knowledge was never truly lost. It was preserved and passed down through Roman and Islamic scholars, eventually becoming a foundational element of medieval university education. The Christian Church, often portrayed as the villain in this narrative, did not enforce a flat earth doctrine. Major theologians like Thomas Aquinas and scholars like the Venerable Bede and Roger Bacon all wrote about the world as a globe. The primary cosmological debate of the era was not about the Earth's shape, but its position in the universe. The geocentric model, which placed the Earth at the center, was the prevailing theory, but its spherical nature was not in question. So where did this persistent myth come from? It was largely popularized in the 19th century by writers like Washington Irving, who, in his biography of Columbus, embellished the historical account for dramatic effect. The narrative of a brave innovator fighting against ignorant medieval dogmatism fit perfectly with the 19th century's own perception of itself as an age of progress and reason. It was a story that made the past seem darker, in order to make the present seem brighter. This reinvention of the past, casting the Middle Ages as a convenient opposite to modernity, is a recurring theme in many of its most enduring myths. It transforms a complex and varied 1,000-year period into a simple caricature. This is nowhere more evident than in the lurid and sensational tale of the Droit du Seigneur, or the Right of the Lord. It's a concept that has fueled countless dramatic scenes in movies and novels. The tyrannical feudal lord, claiming a supposed right to spend the first night with the bride of any of his vassals. The idea, also known as jus primae noctis, is one of the most infamous emblems of medieval oppression. It paints a picture of absolute power and the complete subjugation of the peasantry, where even the most intimate moments of life were subject to the whims of the ruling class. The image is powerful, disturbing, and has firmly lodged itself in the popular imagination as a definitive example of feudal cruelty. Yet, when we search for this practice in the vast historical record of the Middle Ages, we find a curious and telling silence. Despite its popularity in fiction, there is no credible historical evidence that this rite of the first night ever existed as an institutionalized law or a formal rite anywhere in medieval Europe. No legal codes, no manorial records, no chronicles written during the period describe it as a genuine custom. The few vague references that do exist are from centuries later, often written by authors with a clear agenda to portray the feudal system in the worst possible light. The myth seems to have gained significant traction during the Enlightenment of the 17th and 18th centuries. Thinkers and satirists, eager to critique the perceived injustices of the old aristocratic order, used the idea of just prime noctis as a powerful rhetorical weapon. It became a symbol of the barbarism and tyranny they believed their own age of reason had overcome. It was a useful fiction, a propagandistic tool to highlight the supposed depravity of the past and celebrate the progress of the present. So how could such a specific story emerge? Historians suggest it might be a dramatic misinterpretation of other, very real, feudal obligations. For a peasant to marry, they often had to pay a fee to their lord, a tax known in England as a merchat. This was not a payment to avoid the lord's unwanted attentions, but rather a compensation to the lord for the loss of a worker from his estate, especially if the bride was moving to another manor over time. This mundane financial transaction may have been twisted and embellished into the sensational story we know today. Furthermore, the practical application of such a rite would have been socially explosive. In a world where honor, community bonds, and religious piety were deeply ingrained, the systematic enforcement of such a practice would have invited constant, violent rebellion. It would have undermined the very fabric of the feudal agreement, which, while hierarchical, was based on mutual, albeit unequal, obligations. A lord's legitimacy rested on his ability to provide stability and protection, a role that would be impossible to maintain while engaging in such a universally condemned act. Ultimately, the right of the Lord tells us far more about the anxieties and agendas of the people who popularized the myth than it does about the actual lives of people in the Middle Ages. It's a ghost story, a cautionary tale concocted centuries later, that has managed to haunt our perception of the medieval world, obscuring a more complex and human reality. Just as the myth of the right of the Lord paints a distorted picture of medieval social structures, so too does another popular belief distort the daily reality of medieval life. This is the pervasive idea of filth. We are often led to imagine a world enveloped in a permanent layer of grime, a time when people were utterly ignorant of hygiene, where bathing was a once-a-year ordeal, and the stench of unwashed bodies was an inescapable fact of life. This image of the unwashed medieval peasant is a staple of popular culture, but it is a profoundly misleading one. The truth is that medieval people, particularly in the earlier centuries of the period, were likely cleaner than their counterparts in the Renaissance and early modern era that followed. Far from being an alien concept, bathing was a regular and often communal activity. Towns and cities across Europe were dotted with public bathhouses, known in England as stews. These establishments were incredibly popular, serving not only as places to get clean but also as important social hubs. Much like a modern-day cafe or pub, people would go to bathe, relax, and socialize with their neighbors. These bathhouses typically offered hot water, steam rooms, and even services like haircuts or basic medical procedures. For the wealthy, bathing was a more private and luxurious affair. Records from noble households detail the use of large wooden tubs, often padded with linen for comfort and filled with hot water scented with herbs and flowers like chamomile or lavender. They were places of leisure, where a lord might even conduct business or enjoy a meal while soaking in the tub. And what of soap? It was certainly not a modern invention. Soaps made from animal fats, like tallow, and alkaline substances, like ash or lye, were widely available and produced by specialized craftsmen. While the common person's soap might have been a simple, unscented block, the wealthy could purchase expensive fragrance soaps imported from the Mediterranean, made with olive oil and aromatic scents. People also used abrasive materials like sand or rough cloths to scrub their skin, showing a clear understanding of the need to exfoliate and cleanse. Personal grooming extended beyond just bathing. Archaeological finds from the period are rich with personal hygiene tools. Combs made of bone, wood, or ivory are common discoveries, as are tweezers and even ear scoops. Washing hands before and after meals was a standard point of etiquette, especially in polite society, with ewers of water and basins being a standard feature of any formal dinner. While their understanding of germ theory was non-existent, they certainly associated dirt with squalor and cleanliness, with health and social standing. Ironically, the widespread cultural aversion to bathing came later, during the Renaissance. New medical theories began to gain traction, suggesting that water could open the skin's pores and allow diseases or miasmas to enter the body. This fear, combined with the spread of diseases like syphilis through some public baths, led to their gradual closure and a decline in full-body immersion bathing. For a time, it was the supposedly more enlightened people of the 16th and 17th centuries who were far more likely to avoid water, preferring to cleanse themselves with linen cloths and heavy perfumes. So, the next time you imagine the medieval world, it is worth adjusting the sensory details. While their environments certainly faced challenges with sanitation, especially in growing cities, the people themselves were not content to live in filth. They sought comfort, cleanliness, and the simple pleasure of a hot bath, a small but significant piece of their humanity that has been largely washed away by myth. This revised image of a cleaner, more fragrant medieval world naturally leads us to question our assumptions about their other senses, particularly taste. The common belief holds that medieval cuisine was a bland, repetitive, and uninspired affair. We imagine peasants subsisting on endless bowls of thin, tasteless gruel, and nobles gnawing on plain hunks of roasted meat. The medieval menu, in the popular imagination, is a study in beige and brown, a monotonous diet born of necessity and a lack of culinary imagination. Yet, this picture could not be further from the truth, especially for those with any means. In reality, the medieval world was the stage for a global explosion of flavor. The spice trade was one of the most powerful economic forces of the age, driving exploration and connecting Europe to the distant markets of Asia and the Middle East. Spices were not merely preservatives, they were the ultimate status symbol, a way for the wealthy to display their power and worldliness on the dinner table. The kitchens of medieval castles and manors were aromatic laboratories, filled with the scents of spices that we might now consider exotic. Black pepper, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, mace, ginger, saffron, and cardamom were all used with an abundance that would seem startling to the modern palate. A wealthy host would instruct their cooks to use spices liberally, ensuring that every dish was a potent and complex blend of flavors. Blandness was a sign of poverty, intense. Layered flavor was a sign of prestige. Medieval elite cuisine also had a distinct preference for combining sweet and savory elements in a way that is less common today. A single dish could feature minced meat cooked with sugar, ground almonds, and dried fruits like dates or raisins, all seasoned with a sharp tang of vinegar and a warm dusting of cinnamon and cloves. Sauces, a cornerstone of their cooking, were often thickened with breadcrumbs rather than flour, and balanced these sweet, sour, and spicy notes to create a powerful culinary experience. Color was just as important as taste. Cooks were masters of presentation and used natural ingredients to create visually stunning dishes. Saffron or egg yolks could make a sauce a brilliant gold. Ground parsley could turn it a vibrant green, and sandalwood or alkanet could produce a deep, appealing red. A grand feast was a form of theater, and the food was meant to be as dazzling to the eyes as it was to the taste buds, a multisensory spectacle of wealth and sophistication. But what of the common person? While they certainly did not have access to a chest full of foreign spices, their diet was not entirely devoid of flavor. The peasant's garden was a crucial source of seasoning. Potent flavorings like garlic, onions, and leeks formed the base of many meals. Mustard, which grew wild and was easily cultivated, provided a sharp, peppery kick, and a wide array of herbs like rosemary, thyme, parsley, and sage were used to add aroma and complexity to the ubiquitous pottage, the thick grain and vegetable stew that was a staple of their diet. Far from being a culinary dark age, the medieval period was a time of immense flavor and creativity. It was an era that celebrated bold, aromatic, and complex tastes, a far cry from the bland and boring menu so often depicted. The desire for a flavorful meal is a universal human constant, and the people of the Middle Ages were no exception. This journey beyond the myths of the medieval world, past the imagined filth and flavorless food, brings us to the largest and most misleading myth of all, the very name that is often used to describe the period itself: the Dark Ages. The term evokes a powerful image of a 1,000-year intellectual winter, a time when the light of classical civilization was extinguished, and humanity stumbled through an era of superstition, violence, and ignorance. It suggests a great pause in human progress, a void between the glories of Rome and the rebirth of the Renaissance. But this entire concept of a dark age is a historical fiction, a label applied retrospectively by those who wished to define their own era by denigrating the one that came before. The term was first coined in the 14th century by the Italian scholar Petrarch as a passionate admirer of ancient Greece and Rome. He viewed the centuries that followed the fall of the Roman Empire as a dark period of cultural decline compared to the light of classical antiquity. It was, for him, a personal and poetic judgment, not an objective historical analysis. This idea was eagerly adopted and expanded upon by later Enlightenment thinkers in the 18th century. They championed reason and secularism, and found it useful to portray the preceding medieval period, with its strong emphasis on faith, as a monolithic age of superstition. By painting the Middle Ages as uniformly dark, they could present their own time as a heroic and necessary dawn of reason and enlightenment. The Dark Ages became a caricature, a rhetorical tool used to celebrate their own achievements. In reality, the era was far from a period of intellectual stagnation. One of its most vital functions was the preservation of knowledge. Across Europe, in quiet monastic scriptoriums, monks diligently copied and recopied ancient texts, while their primary focus was religious scripture. They also preserved the works of classical poets, philosophers, and scientists. Without the tireless labor of these scribes, the foundational texts of Western civilization, from Virgil to Aristotle, would have vanished into oblivion. Furthermore, the Middle Ages were a period of significant innovation and technological advancement. This was the era that saw the invention and widespread adoption of the heavy plow and the horse collar, which revolutionized agriculture and allowed for greater food production. It gave us the mechanical clock, which fundamentally changed how people perceived and organized time. It produced eyeglasses, dramatically extending the working lives of scholars and craftsmen. It was a time of practical problem-solving and slow, steady technological progress. Perhaps the most significant and enduring intellectual achievement of the era was the creation of the university, beginning in the 11th and 12th centuries in cities like Bologna, Paris, and Oxford. These institutions emerged as new centers for learning and debate. They were founded on the principles of scholasticism, a method that used logic and reason to explore questions of philosophy and theology. Far from stifling thought, universities created a vibrant intellectual culture that laid the groundwork for the scientific revolution to come. To dismiss 1,000 years of human history, a period that saw the rise of nations, the construction of breathtaking cathedrals, and the birth of the university, as simply dark, is to ignore the complexity and dynamism of the past. It was an age of profound transformation, not of stagnation, a time that forged a new civilization from the remnants of the old, laying the essential foundations upon which our modern world is built. Leaving the myth of the intellectual void behind, we turn now to perhaps the most iconic figure of the Middle Ages, the knight in shining armor. In our collective imagination, he is a figure of contradictions. On one hand, he is a symbol of chivalry and martial prowess. On the other, he is often depicted as a clumsy, near-helpless figure, encased in a steel shell so heavy and restrictive that he can barely move. This is the comedic image of the knight, a man who needs a crane to be hoisted onto his horse, who waddles like a penguin, and who, if he ever falls, is left as helpless as an overturned turtle. This portrayal, while entertaining, fundamentally misunderstands what a suit of plate armor was and how it functioned. It was not a crude iron prison, but a sophisticated piece of personal protective equipment, the pinnacle of medieval metallurgy and craftsmanship. Each suit was custom-fitted to its wearer, a complex system of articulated plates designed to offer maximum protection while sacrificing as little mobility as possible. It was, in essence, a wearable fortress, designed for the brutal reality of the battlefield. Let's first address the question of weight. A full suit of battle-ready plate armor from the 15th century typically weighed between 20 and 25 kilograms, or about 45 to 55 pounds. While this is certainly not insignificant, the crucial factor is its distribution. Unlike a modern soldier's backpack, which concentrates weight on the shoulders and back, the weight of a suit of armor was spread evenly across the entire body, from the head and shoulders down to the feet. A physically fit man, trained from a young age, could bear this weight effectively for extended periods. In fact, the burden carried by a medieval knight was often less than that of a modern infantry soldier, who can carry anywhere from 60 to over 100 pounds of gear. The genius of the medieval armorer was in creating a system that integrated this weight with the natural movement of the human body. The armor was a second skin of steel, not a cage. The key to this was articulation. A well-made suit of armor was composed of dozens of interlocking plates, connected by internal leather straps and pivoting rivets at the major joints, the shoulders, elbows, hips, and knees. This design allowed for a surprisingly complete range of motion. A knight in full plate could run, crouch, jump, and climb a ladder. Historical combat manuals depict armored men wrestling and fighting on the ground with daggers. Modern reconstructions by skilled armorers and historians have proven this conclusively. People wearing accurately made replicas can perform rolls, cartwheels, and fight with remarkable agility. So, where did the myth of the clumsy knight come from? It likely stems from two sources. The first is specialized jousting armor. This ceremonial armor, designed solely to withstand the focused impact of a lance in a tournament, was indeed much heavier and more rigid than battle armor. Its purpose was safety in a specific sporting context, not agility in a chaotic melee. The second source is the poorly made, ill-fitting suits of armor that appeared in later centuries for parades or as decorations, which were never intended for serious combat. The image of the helpless, immobile knight is a caricature that does a great disservice to the skill of the craftsman who made the armor and the strength and athleticism of the men who wore it. A knight on the battlefield was not a lumbering giant. He was a highly trained, well-protected, and surprisingly agile weapon of war. Having corrected our view of the knight's armor, we must also re-examine the weapon he is most famous for wielding, the sword, in popular culture. The medieval sword is often depicted as a monstrously large and heavy implement. We see fantasy heroes carrying blades that are impossibly wide and thick, great slabs of sharpened steel that seem to require superhuman strength just to lift, let alone swing. This has cemented an image of medieval sword fighting as a crude contest of brute force, with warriors relying on sheer weight and power to bludgeon their armored foes into submission. This perception, much like the myth of the clumsy knight, is born from fantasy rather than historical fact. The reality of medieval swords is a testament to sophisticated engineering and an intimate understanding of physics and ergonomics. The primary goal of a swordsmith was not to create the heaviest weapon possible, but rather the most efficient and deadly. A sword that was too heavy would be a fatal liability in combat, quickly exhausting its wielder and rendering them slow and defenseless. Let's consider the actual weight. A typical single-handed arming sword of the high Middle Ages weighed approximately 1.1 to 1.3 kilograms, or around 2.5 to 3 pounds. Even the larger two-handed longswords, which required both hands to use effectively, rarely weighed more than 2 kilograms, or about 4.5 pounds. To put that in perspective, these weapons were often lighter than a modern assault rifle. They were not the clumsy, weighty crowbars of fiction. The true genius of a well-crafted sword lay not in its mass, but in its balance and distribution of weight. A master smith would forge a blade with a subtle distal taper, meaning it grew progressively thinner from the hilt towards the tip. This, combined with a carefully weighted pommel at the end of the handle, created a point of balance just a few inches from the hand. The result was a weapon that felt nimble and responsive, an extension of the wielder's arm. It could be maneuvered with speed and precision, allowing for swift cuts and deadly thrusts. These were not crude, bludgeoning tools. Medieval swords were exceptionally sharp, capable of inflicting grievous wounds with clean-drawing cuts. Combat was a deadly art, a science of defense, as the historical manuals called it, based on timing, leverage, and technique. A swordsman would use deft movements to find the gaps in his opponent's armor, the joints of the elbows, the neck, the armpits, rather than simply trying to smash through solid steel plate. Much of our modern misunderstanding comes from handling cheap, decorative replicas, often called wall hangers. These are typically made of stainless steel, which is not suitable for a functional blade, and are poorly balanced, unsharpened, and far heavier than their historical counterparts. They are sword-shaped objects, not true swords, and they feel as clumsy and unwieldy as the myths suggest a real sword should. While exceptionally large, ceremonial, or specialized weapons did exist, like the greatswords of the later Renaissance, they were not the standard armament of a medieval knight. The everyday sword of the medieval warrior was a light, fast, and exquisitely balanced weapon, engineered for a lethal and highly technical form of combat. It was a tool of deadly grace, not of brute, cumbersome force. Having established a more realistic image of the medieval warrior, let us now broaden our view to the entire medieval population and address one of the most persistent and misunderstood statistics about the era. We have all heard the claim: life expectancy in the Middle Ages was a mere 30 years. This single, stark number paints a grim picture of a world populated almost exclusively by the young, where reaching the age of 40 was a remarkable achievement, and old age as we know it was a rare luxury. It suggests a society in a constant state of demographic churn, with little opportunity for the accumulation of wisdom that comes with a long life. This statistic, however, is a classic example of how averages can be deeply misleading. The figure for life expectancy at birth is not, as many assume, the typical age of death for an adult. Instead, it is a mathematical mean, one that is brutally skewed by a single, tragic factor: an appallingly high rate of infant and child mortality. In an age without vaccines, modern sanitation, or antibiotics, the first few years of life were extraordinarily perilous. Countless children succumbed to diseases that are now easily preventable or treatable. A simple infection, a bout of dysentery, or common childhood illnesses like measles could prove fatal. Some historical estimates suggest that as many as 1 in 3 infants died before their first birthday, and perhaps half of all people died before reaching adolescence. When a huge portion of your population is registered as dying at age 0, 1, or 2, the mathematical average for the entire population is dragged dramatically downward. The key to a truer understanding is to ask a different question. What was the life expectancy of someone who survived the dangers of childhood? If a medieval person made it to their early 20s, having weathered the storms of early life, their prospects changed entirely. A 21-year-old in the 14th century, for example, could reasonably expect to live to be 50 or even older. Reaching one's 60s or 70s was by no means unheard of, especially among the upper classes who had better nutrition and were somewhat shielded from the rigors of manual labor. The historical record is filled with examples of individuals who lived long and impactful lives. Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most powerful women of the High Middle Ages, lived to be around 82. The famous philosopher and theologian Thomas Aquinas lived to be nearly 50. While these are members of the elite, their lifespans demonstrate what was biologically possible, and that the idea of everyone dying young is a fallacy. Society was not devoid of its elders. There were grandparents, village wise women, and experienced craftsmen who passed down their skills and knowledge through the generations. While a life of hard agricultural labor would certainly have taken its toll, aging a person's body prematurely by modern standards, the image of a world without an older generation is incorrect. The village elder was a real and respected figure, and the community relied on their accumulated experience. So, while life in the Middle Ages was certainly more precarious than our own, the notion that it was a fleeting 30-year flash is a statistical illusion. It was a world where the first hurdle of survival was immense, but for those who cleared it, a full and reasonably long life was not an impossible dream, but a genuine possibility. Understanding that medieval society was composed of people who lived longer and more complex lives than the myths suggest, we must also reconsider how their society was governed and how justice was administered. The popular image of medieval law is often one of barbaric cruelty and blind superstition, dominated by the infamous trial by ordeal. We picture accused individuals being forced to hold red-hot iron bars or being bound and thrown into a river, their guilt or innocence determined by whether their wounds festered or if their bodies floated or sank. This dramatic vision suggests a legal system devoid of reason, relying entirely on divine chance. While it is true that trial by ordeal was practiced, particularly in the early Middle Ages, it was neither the universal standard for justice nor a product of simple, unthinking superstition. It was a specific judicial tool, typically used as a last resort in serious criminal cases where there were no witnesses and no confession. It was an appeal to what they called Judicium Dei, the judgment of God. The underlying belief was that an omnipotent and just God would intervene directly, performing a small miracle to protect the innocent and expose the guilty. To the medieval mind, this was not an abdication of justice, but an appeal to the highest court imaginable. In a world where faith was the central organizing principle of life, calling upon God to reveal the truth was seen as a profoundly logical step. When human methods failed, the ordeal was a solemn, ritualized ceremony, presided over by a priest who would pray for God to make the truth known. It was, in its own context, a rational process, albeit one founded on a premise of divine intervention. However, the sensational nature of the ordeal has completely overshadowed the far more common and mundane methods by which justice was typically handled. The vast majority of legal disputes were resolved through processes that are much more familiar to us. Witness testimony was paramount. Courts would hear from people who had seen a crime or could attest to a person's whereabouts. Oaths were also a cornerstone of the system. An accused person could often clear their name through compurgation, a process where they, along with a number of reputable oath helpers from their community, would formally swear to their innocence. This reliance on community and reputation meant that justice was, in many ways, a local and social affair. Furthermore, the goal of the legal system was often restitution and the restoration of social peace, rather than simply punishment. Many offenses were settled through a structured system of fines and compensation, known in the Germanic tradition as Wehrgeld or manprice. A specific monetary value was placed on a person's life and property, and this sum would be paid to the victim or their family to settle the dispute and prevent a cycle of revenge. Crucially, the practice of trial by ordeal came to an end not because of some outside enlightenment, but through an evolution of thought from within the medieval world itself. The most influential theologians of the Church grew increasingly skeptical of the practice, arguing that it was theologically unsound to force God to perform a miracle on demand. This movement culminated in 1215 at the Fourth Lateran Council, when Pope Innocent III formally forbade the clergy from participating in ordeals. Without the Church's administration and blessing, the practice lost its legitimacy and rapidly faded from use across Europe. The decline of the ordeal spurred the development of more evidence-based procedures, most notably the precursor to the modern jury system in England. The medieval legal world was not a static landscape of superstition. It was a dynamic system that wrestled with complex questions of evidence, truth, and faith, and which ultimately evolved to lay the foundations of the Western legal tradition. This evolving understanding of medieval law naturally leads us to the grim topic of punishment. When we think of medieval justice, our minds often conjure images of dark, dripping dungeons filled with elaborate and sadistic devices of torture. And no single device has captured the gruesome imagination more than the Iron Maiden. It is the very emblem of medieval cruelty, a human-shaped iron cabinet lined with sharp spikes, which closes slowly on its victim, inflicting a horrific, piercing death. It appears in museums, movies, and folklore as the ultimate instrument of torment. This terrifying image, however, has one significant problem. It is a complete fabrication. The Iron Maiden is not a medieval torture device. In fact, there is absolutely no historical evidence that such a machine existed or was used during the Middle Ages. We find no mention of it in any of the period's extensive legal texts, chronicles, or personal accounts. No designs for it appear in any manuscript. For an era that was often meticulous in its records of justice and punishment, the silence on the Iron Maiden is definitive. The real story of this macabre invention begins much later. In the late 18th century, the first known account of a device like an Iron Maiden appears in a text written in 1793 by the philosopher Johann Philipp Debunking. He wrote about the alleged execution of a coin forger in 1515 by a spiked sarcophagus. But his story was likely a piece of imaginative fiction, a sensational tale based on rumor and a misinterpretation of an old public humiliation device. It was this story that likely inspired the creation of the object we now know. The first physical Iron Maiden was probably constructed around 1802. It was a fascinating and gruesome object created to be displayed, to draw crowds, and to cater to a growing Romantic-era fascination with the supposed barbarism of the medieval past. It was a piece of theater, a work of historical fiction made tangible. designed to shock and entertain a modern audience. The most famous example, the Iron Maiden of Nuremberg, which was destroyed in an Allied bombing raid in 1945, was likely a composite object. Historians who examined it believe it was assembled from a genuine 16th-century wooden cabinet, possibly a type of shame cloak used for public humiliation, to which spikes were added at a much later date to create a more terrifying spectacle. It was an artifact designed to confirm a myth, not a genuine relic from the past. This is not to say that the Middle Ages were a gentle or humane period. Torture was certainly practiced, although its application was often legally restricted to specific circumstances, such as cases of treason or heresy, where it was used to extract confessions. The methods they used were undeniably horrific. Devices like the rack, the thumbscrew, and the strappado were real and brutal instruments, but the focus was often on inflicting pain to get information, not necessarily on creating an elaborate killing machine like the Iron Maiden. The Iron Maiden, therefore, tells us very little about the reality of medieval punishment. Instead, it speaks volumes about our own enduring fascination with the Gothic and the grotesque. It is a powerful symbol, but it is a symbol of a myth, a reflection of how later centuries chose to imagine the medieval world as a place of unimaginable cruelty, rather than how it truly was. Just as the Iron Maiden created a false narrative about medieval justice, another infamous object has created a powerful myth about medieval relationships and morality. This is the chastity belt. The story is known to all. A jealous knight, preparing to leave for the Crusades or a long war, would lock his wife into a terrifying iron contraption to physically guarantee her fidelity while he was away. The object has become a potent symbol of the era's supposed sexual repression, the subjugation of women, and a brutish, distrustful view of marriage. This powerful symbol, however, shares a crucial characteristic with the Iron Maiden. It is a myth. There is no reliable evidence to suggest that chastity belts were ever used during the Middle Ages. Extensive searches of the historical and archaeological record have produced nothing. No such device has ever been found in a medieval archaeological dig. No law code, personal letter, or chronicle from the period makes any credible reference to one being used. Much like the Iron Maiden, it is a specter, a haunting image projected onto the past from a later time. The sole piece of evidence, often cited by proponents of the myth, is a drawing in a 15th century manuscript called Bellefortis, created by Conrad Kaiser. The book is a manual of military technology, and among its many illustrations of siege engines and weapons, there is indeed a drawing of what appears to be a chastity belt. However, Kaiser's work is filled with dozens of bizarre, theoretical, and even satirical contraptions that were never meant to be built. The inclusion of the chastity belt is widely believed by scholars to have been a joke or a metaphorical illustration, not a practical design. The idea of the chastity belt and the first physical examples of them only begin to appear centuries after the Middle Ages had ended. They were products of the Renaissance and, more significantly, the 18th and 19th centuries. The objects we sometimes see displayed in museums as medieval chastity belts are almost all later creations, often identified as 19th century forgeries or curiosities. They were made to satisfy a modern fascination with a past that was imagined to be both barbaric and titillating. Furthermore, one must consider the sheer medical and practical impossibility of the device. A metal contraption of that kind, locked onto a person's body for weeks, months, or years, would be an instrument of slow, agonizing death. The constant friction would cause severe abrasions, and the lack of hygiene would inevitably lead to rampant infections and disease. It was simply not a survivable or functional device for long-term wear, a fact that would have been obvious to anyone in any era. So why were these objects made in later centuries? Some were likely created as macabre jokes or as pieces for private collections of erotica, more commonly. However, the concept gained popularity in the Victorian era. The 19th century saw the creation of a number of devices intended to prevent masturbation, a practice that the medical establishment of the time viewed with alarm. These genuine, though misguided, Victorian contraptions likely fueled the myth, and their own anxieties about sexuality were anachronistically projected back onto the supposedly less civilized people of the Middle Ages. Ultimately, the story of the chastity belt is not about the crude jealousy of medieval knights. It is about the complex attitudes towards sexuality, gender, and history that developed in the centuries that followed. It remains a powerful symbol, but what it symbolizes is the tendency of every age to reinvent the past in its own image. Having dismantled the myths surrounding the physical objects of the Middle Ages, we now return to the realm of ideas, to address a misconception that lies at the very heart of the Dark Ages narrative. This is the widespread belief that the medieval church was a monolithic and oppressive force that actively suppressed science, persecuted rational thinkers, and held humanity in a state of enforced ignorance. The popular story is one of an inherent and eternal conflict between faith and reason, where the church systematically stamped out any spark of scientific inquiry that threatened its dogma. This narrative, often called the conflict thesis, is a powerful one, but it is a gross oversimplification of a far more complex and interesting relationship. Far from being the sworn enemy of science, the medieval church was, for much of the period, its primary sponsor and guardian. In an age where political and social structures were often fragmented, the church provided the institutional stability and the intellectual framework within which learning and natural philosophy, the precursor to modern science, could survive and grow. The process began in the monasteries, where, as we've discussed, ancient texts, including the scientific works of Greek and Roman thinkers like Aristotle and Galen, were preserved. But the church's role went far beyond simple preservation. The very universities that became the great intellectual centers of the High Middle Ages were church-sponsored institutions. Paris, Oxford, Cambridge, Bologna, all were founded under the aegis of the church, and theology was considered the queen of the sciences. Within these universities, the study of the natural world was a core part of the curriculum. The methods of scholasticism, with their rigorous emphasis on logic and argumentation, trained generations of thinkers to analyze the world around them. Many of the most important figures in the development of medieval science were themselves churchmen. Albertus Magnus, a Dominican friar, was a celebrated biologist and naturalist. Roger Bacon, a Franciscan friar, was a pioneering advocate for empiricism and the experimental method. Even Nicolaus Copernicus, who centuries later would propose the revolutionary heliocentric model, was a canon in the church. This is not to say that there were no conflicts. The church was deeply invested in maintaining its theological doctrines, and it would certainly intervene when a philosophical or scientific proposition appeared to contradict a core tenet of the faith, such as the nature of God or the immortality of the soul. The condemnations of 1277 in Paris, for example, censored a number of philosophical propositions derived from Aristotle. However, these conflicts were almost always about the theological implications of an idea, not about the practice of investigating nature itself. The idea of a perpetual war between science and religion is largely a 19th century invention. It was popularized by writers who sought to champion the cause of secular scientific progress by portraying religion, and particularly the medieval church, as its historical enemy. Modern historians of science have largely rejected this simplistic thesis, recognizing that the relationship was far more intertwined and often symbiotic. For the medieval scholar, faith and reason were not opposing forces. They were two complementary paths to understanding God's creation. To study the intricacies of the natural world was to study the handiwork of God himself. The Church provided the schools, the scholars, and the philosophical framework that made this study possible, creating an intellectual environment that, far from being a dark age, laid the essential foundations for the scientific revolution. Having explored the complex relationship between the Church and science, let us now turn our attention to a specific group of people who are synonymous with the early medieval period, yet are perhaps the most mythologized of all: the Vikings. The very word conjures a specific and powerful image, that of a ferocious, wild-bearded warrior, axe in hand, sailing a longship through the mist, and atop his head, completing this iconic picture, is a helmet adorned with a pair of fearsome horns. This image of the horned helmeted Norseman is one of the most enduring and instantly recognizable historical stereotypes in the world. It is the default costume for any depiction of a Viking, from cartoons and comic books to sports team mascots. It is so deeply ingrained in our culture that to imagine a Viking without his horned helmet feels almost wrong. And yet, it is an image that is entirely, unequivocally false. There is simply no archaeological or historical evidence whatsoever to suggest that Viking warriors wore horned helmets into battle. The historical record is completely silent on the matter. More importantly, extensive archaeological excavations of Viking settlements, ship burials, and battle sites across Scandinavia and Europe have unearthed a wealth of Viking weaponry and armor. They have found swords, axes, spears, and a handful of genuine Viking Age helmets. Not one of them has horns. The most complete Viking helmet ever discovered. The German Boo helmet, found in Norway, gives us a clear picture of what a real Norse chieftain's headwear looked like. It is a practical and unadorned piece of military hardware. It consists of a simple iron cap or bowl made from several plates riveted together, with a spectacle-like guard protecting the eyes and nose. It is functional, effective, and entirely devoid of any horns or decorative wings. Its design is focused on one thing: protecting the wearer's head in a brutal fight. From a purely practical standpoint, wearing a horned helmet in battle would be a profoundly foolish and dangerous idea. In the close-quarters reality of a shield wall or a raid, horns would be a massive liability. They could be grabbed by an opponent to wrench the wearer's head. They could become entangled in a ship's rigging or forest branches, and they would make it far easier for a weapon to catch and deliver a devastating blow. Viking combat was swift and efficient, and their gear reflected that. There was no room for such an impractical and hazardous embellishment. So where did this pervasive myth originate? It is a surprisingly recent invention, dating back to the 19th century. The image was largely cemented in the public imagination by the costume designer Carl Emil Doppler, who created horned helmets for the Norse characters in the 1876 debut of Richard Wagner's epic opera cycle, Der Ring des Nibelungen. The dramatic, romantic, and wildly popular opera created a powerful visual language that has stuck with us ever since. This 19th century artistic choice may have been inspired by discoveries of much older artifacts from the Nordic Bronze Age, a period more than 1,000 years before the Vikings. Some ceremonial helmets and rock carvings from this ancient era do depict figures with horns, but these were likely ritual objects, not battle gear. Wagner and his contemporaries simply conflated these ancient symbols with the Vikings, creating a potent but historically inaccurate hybrid that has defined the Viking image to this day. Removing the imaginary horns from the Viking helmet is the first step towards seeing the Norse people of the early Middle Ages more clearly. But we must also look past the helmet to the person wearing it and challenge the myth of their character. The popular caricature of the Viking is that of a one-dimensional berserker, a savage brute driven by an insatiable lust for blood and plunder. In this telling, they are little more than pirates, a destructive force with no culture, no laws, and no ambition beyond burning, looting, and killing. This image is not entirely without foundation, but it is a profoundly incomplete one. It is a portrait painted almost exclusively by their victims, primarily the Christian monks and scribes, whose monasteries were often the targets of brutal Viking raids. For the monks of Lindisfarne in 793, who saw their sacred treasures stolen and their brothers slain, the Norsemen were indeed a terrifying and seemingly demonic force. Their chronicles, which for a long time were our primary sources, understandably focused on this aspect of Viking activity. However, raiding was only one facet of a much more complex Norse society. The Vikings were not just destroyers, they were also traders, explorers, and settlers on a scale unmatched in their era. The very same longship that could carry a war party to an unsuspecting shore was also a marvel of engineering that served as a cargo vessel, connecting vast and disparate parts of the world. They were merchants as much as they were marauders. The Vikings established incredible trade networks that stretched from North America to the Middle East, from their homelands in Scandinavia. They sailed west to Iceland, Greenland, and ultimately to the shores of Newfoundland, which they called Vinland. 5 centuries before Columbus, they sailed south, navigating the great rivers of Russia and Ukraine, to reach the Byzantine Empire, which they called Miklagard, and even the Abbasid Caliphate, trading with merchants in Constantinople and Baghdad. They dealt in a vast array of goods, furs, amber, and walrus ivory from the north, silver, spices, and silk from the east. And, like many cultures of the time, they also traded in enslaved people. These trade routes did more than move goods. They moved ideas, technologies, and people, fundamentally reshaping the economic and political map of Europe. Furthermore, the majority of people in the Viking Age never went a Viking at all. They were farmers, craftsmen, and fishermen, living their lives according to the seasons in their Scandinavian homelands. And for many of those who did set sail, the ultimate goal was not plunder, but land. They were colonists, seeking new places to settle and farm. They populated the uninhabited island of Iceland, established communities across the British Isles, founded the city of Dublin, and ruled a large swath of England known as the Danelaw. Norse society was not the lawless anarchy of popular myth. It was governed by sophisticated legal codes, administered through a system of local and regional assemblies known as a thing. At these open-air gatherings, free men would pass laws, adjudicate disputes, and make political decisions. It was a society that valued law, honor, and reputation, and which possessed a rich culture of intricate art, complex mythology, and epic oral poetry that would eventually be written down in the sagas. To see the Vikings only as raiders is to see only a single, violent chapter of a much grander story. They were a dynamic and influential people whose impact as explorers, traders, and nation builders was every bit as significant as their legacy as warriors. Just as we have replaced the caricature of the Viking with a more nuanced historical portrait, so too must we reconsider the world they and other medieval peoples inhabited, and no structure is more central to our image of the Middle Ages than the castle. We see it in our mind's eye as a formidable silhouette of gray stone, a dark, damp, and forbidding place. The word castle itself often evokes a sense of gloom, of cold, echoing corridors, bare stone walls, and a life of grim, Spartan discomfort, sacrificed for the sake of defense. This perception of the castle as a purely military structure, devoid of warmth or beauty, is largely a modern one, shaped by the crumbling and weather-beaten ruins that are left to us today. But a medieval castle was not a ruin, it was a home, a bustling center of administration, and a vibrant symbol of its lord's wealth and status. As such, comfort, and especially appearance, were of immense importance. The drab, gray fortress of our imagination was, in reality, often a blaze of color. Exterior stone walls were rarely left bare. The common practice was to render them with a thick layer of plaster and then whitewash them, which gave the castle a brilliant, gleaming appearance that could be seen for miles. This wasn't just for aesthetics. The plaster also served a practical purpose, protecting the mortar in the stone joints from the damaging effects of wind and rain. Some lords went even further, painting their castles in rich colors or with elaborate patterns like checkerboards or stripes to display their wealth and individuality. The interior of the castle was just as colorful. The cold stone walls we see today would have been completely alien to a medieval resident. Inside, the walls were also plastered and then painted, often with intricate murals. These paintings might depict scenes from the Bible, heroic legends, or geometric patterns that mimicked the look of expensive tile or drapery. The goal was to transform a cold stone surface into a warm, inviting, and impressive space. The most important element of interior decoration, however, was the tapestry. These enormous woven works of art were the ultimate luxury item. They were incredibly expensive, depicting complex narrative scenes with a stunning richness of color and detail, hung on the walls of the great hall and private chambers. They served a dual purpose. They were a breathtaking display of wealth and taste, and they provided a vital layer of insulation, trapping warm air and keeping out the drafts from the stone walls. Light and warmth were a constant concern, while defensive areas of the castle had narrow arrow slits for windows. The domestic areas, like the Great Hall, often had much larger windows to let in natural light in the evenings. The space would be illuminated by dozens, if not hundreds, of candles and torches. Great central hearths, and later, large fireplaces, blazed with roaring fires, providing not just heat, but a cheerful, welcoming light that would dance across the painted walls and colorful tapestries. The floors would not have been bare stone, but would be covered in woven rush mats, which were often mixed with sweet-smelling herbs like lavender or meadowsweet to freshen the air. Furniture was solid and often ornately carved and painted, while the Lord's bed was typically a grand four-poster affair, hung with heavy curtains that could be drawn to create a small, warm, and private room within a room. The medieval castle was not a dreary ruin. It was a vibrant, multi-sensory environment designed to be as impressive and comfortable as the technology of the age would allow. Having illuminated the colorful reality of the medieval castle, we must now turn our gaze from the Lord in his great hall to the vast majority of the population who lived and worked outside its walls, the peasantry. The myth of the medieval peasant is one of utter misery and helplessness. We imagine the serf as being effectively a slave, bound to the land and the whim of his lord, living a life of ceaseless, back-breaking toil with no rights, no freedom, and no hope of ever improving his station. It is a picture of total subjugation. While the life of a medieval peasant was undeniably difficult and subject to the authority of a lord, this picture of absolute powerlessness is a distortion. The system of serfdom, which bound a peasant to the land, was not the same as chattel slavery. A serf could not be bought and sold as an individual piece of property, separated from their family or their home. They had a recognized, albeit lowly, place in the social order, and crucially, within that order, they had customary rights. Life on the manor was governed by a complex set of traditions and customs, which were administered through the manorial court, while the lord or his steward presided over this court. Its judgments were based on long-standing precedent. This system provided a legal framework for the community, and it was a venue that peasants themselves used. Court records from the period are filled with cases of peasants suing one another over land disputes or property damage. More surprisingly, peasants could also use the manorial court to defend their rights against their own lord. They could argue that the lord was demanding labor beyond what was customary, or imposing a fine that was unjust, and they did not always lose. While the system was certainly weighted in the lord's favor, a lord who consistently ignored established customs risked undermining his own authority and provoking unrest. The law, even customary law, had power. The idea that peasants were entirely static, living and dying within sight of their village church, is also an oversimplification. While this was true for many, there was a degree of mobility. Peasants regularly traveled to nearby market towns to sell surplus produce and buy goods they could not make themselves. Some found opportunities to move to new villages or to clear new land for farming. Furthermore, a path to freedom existed. A widely recognized custom in many parts of Europe held that a serf who escaped to a chartered town and lived there for a year and a day without being captured would be granted their freedom. It is also important to remember that the peasantry was not one single, undifferentiated mass. It was a stratified society with many levels. At the bottom were serfs, known as villeins in England, who owed the most labor and had the fewest rights. But there were also free peasants, who rented their land for cash or even owned it outright. These yeomen, as they were called in England, were independent farmers and formed a significant part of rural society. The line between free and unfree was not always sharp, and one's status could vary enormously depending on time and place. Finally, peasants were not always passive in the face of injustice. They had numerous ways to resist, from small, everyday acts like working slowly or poaching in the Lord's forest, to organized protests and, at times, large-scale, violent uprisings like the English peasants' revolt of 1381. These rebellions, while often brutally suppressed, demonstrate that peasants had a strong sense of their own rights and were willing to fight and die for them. Theirs was a life of struggle, but it was not a life without agency. Having established a more nuanced view of the medieval peasant's life, we now turn to an event that shattered their world and the world of everyone in it, from the lowest serf to the highest king. The Black Death, the Great Plague of the mid-14th century, was a catastrophe on an almost unimaginable scale. The popular narrative of this event is one of complete and utter chaos. It paints a picture of a society that, when confronted with a force it could not understand, dissolved into madness, superstition, and hysteria, with social order collapsing entirely under the weight of death. The sheer terror and devastation of the plague should not be understated. It was a horrifying, bewildering event that killed a third to a half of Europe's population in just a few years. The psychological shock was immense, and for many, it did feel like the end of the world. But the idea that the response was purely one of panicked superstition is not accurate. Faced with this existential threat, medieval people reacted not just with fear, but also with reason, pragmatism, and a remarkable degree of civic organization. While they had no knowledge of bacteria or viruses, educated people did attempt to understand the plague through the scientific lens of their time. The prevailing medical theory was the miasma theory, which held that disease was spread by corrupted air or bad humors. The medical faculty at the University of Paris, commissioned by the King of France, produced a detailed report blaming the plague on a specific planetary conjunction in 1345, which they believed had caused a deadly corruption of the Earth's atmosphere, though incorrect. This was a rational effort to find a natural, physical cause for the disease, not a purely supernatural one. Crucially, these theories, however flawed, led to public health responses that were surprisingly logical. If the plague was carried by bad air, then the sensible thing to do was to try and purify the air and avoid contact with its source. Cities across Europe implemented sanitation measures. They organized the cleaning of streets, forbade the dumping of refuse, and moved foul-smelling industries like animal butchery outside the city walls. People burned aromatic woods like pine and juniper in their homes and in public squares, hoping to drive away the pestilence. More importantly, the crisis led to the systematic development of one of the most powerful tools in public health, the quarantine. Authorities in port cities like Venice and Ragusa observed that the plague seemed to arrive with ships. In 1377, Ragusa passed a law requiring all arriving ships and caravans from plague-affected areas to isolate themselves for a period of 30 days. At Trentino, this was later extended to 40 days. A quarantino, from which we derive our modern word. It was a brilliantly pragmatic innovation, born of careful observation. The notion of a complete societal breakdown is also an exaggeration. While civic life was undoubtedly stretched to its breaking point, it did not simply vanish. In many towns, legal systems continued to function. with a massive number of last wills and testaments being processed. Guilds and religious confraternities stepped in to organize burials when families were too sick or too few to manage on their own. It was a society under the most extreme pressure imaginable, but it was a society that adapted and endured. The people of the 14th century did not have the knowledge to defeat the Black Death, but they were not its passive, unthinking victims. They observed, they theorized, and they innovated, developing practical public health strategies that would form the basis of disease control for centuries to come. Their response was a testament to human resilience and ingenuity in the face of an incomprehensible disaster. The immense social trauma caused by events like the Black Death often led societies to search for scapegoats, for someone to blame for their suffering. This brings us to another dark and persistent myth, one that is almost synonymous with medieval superstition and persecution. The Great Witch Hunts. The image is a terrifying one of a period known as the Burning Times, where the medieval church, in a grip of paranoia, hunted down and burned hundreds of thousands of women accused of witchcraft. This narrative places the witch craze firmly in the heart of the medieval era, presenting it as the ultimate expression of its ignorance and brutality. This placement in history, however, is profoundly incorrect. The vast, systematic, and deadly witch hunts that have so scarred the memory of Europe were not a medieval phenomenon. They belong to the early modern period. The great European witch craze began in the late 15th century, gathered momentum in the 16th, and reached its horrific peak in the 17th century, before finally dying out in the 18th. This was the age of the Renaissance, the Reformation, and the scientific revolution, not the so-called Dark Ages. For most of the medieval period, the official position of the Church was one of skepticism towards the very idea of malevolent witchcraft, as it was later understood. An influential piece of early medieval church law, known as the Canon Episcopi, which circulated from about the 10th century onwards, explicitly condemned the belief in witches as a pagan fallacy. It stated that the notion of women who could fly through the night, change their shape, or consort with demons was a delusion. The Church's main concern was often to punish people for believing in witchcraft, which it considered a dangerous superstition. The common village magic of the time was typically viewed as a minor offense. A person using a folk remedy to heal a cow, or a charm to find a lost object, would most likely be dealt with by a local priest and assigned a penance, such as fasting or prayer. The idea of a grand diabolical conspiracy of witches making pacts with the devil to undermine Christendom was not a feature of the early or high medieval worldview. The intellectual climate began to shift only in the very late Middle Ages. The anxieties and dislocations of the 14th and 15th centuries, combined with the work of certain inquisitors and theologians, slowly began to forge a new and far more sinister theory of witchcraft. This culminated in the publication of the infamous book Malleus Maleficarum, or The Hammer of Witches. In 1487, this text codified the belief in diabolical witchcraft and provided a guidebook for prosecuting accused witches. But it is crucial to recognize that this book appeared at the very twilight of the medieval period. It was a harbinger of the madness that was to come, not a summary of what had already been happening for centuries. It was in the following 200 years, amidst the chaos of the Protestant Reformation, the Catholic Counter-Reformation, and widespread social and political upheaval, that the theories of the Malleus Maleficarum were put into terrifying practice. To associate the great witch hunts primarily with the Middle Ages is to misplace one of history's greatest tragedies. It shifts the blame from the early modern world, a world of printing presses, expanding empires, and great thinkers, back onto the medieval period. The reality is that for much of their history, the people of the Middle Ages were far less concerned with hunting witches than the supposedly more enlightened generations that followed them. Having cleared away the misplaced horror of the witch hunts, we arrive at one of the final, and perhaps most profound, myths of the medieval world: the belief that the lives of ordinary people were an unbroken chain of misery. This narrative suggests that medieval life, particularly for the peasantry, was a grim, joyless, and colorless affair. It paints a picture of a people so crushed by hardship and dominated by a theology that prized the afterlife above all else, that their earthly existence was merely a vale of tears to be endured, devoid of laughter, leisure, or happiness. This view is rooted in a misunderstanding of both their faith and their daily lives. While it is true that Christian doctrine emphasized the transient and difficult nature of earthly existence, this did not preclude the experience of joy. The belief that heaven was the ultimate reward did not stop people from seeking moments of happiness, beauty, and community in the here and now. The human spirit's capacity for joy is not so easily extinguished, and medieval society, for all its hardships, had built-in structures for celebration and leisure. A crucial part of this was the religious calendar. Far from being a source of pure solemnity, it provided the framework for a surprising number of holidays. In fact, it is estimated that the medieval peasant may have had more days off from work than the average modern office worker. The word holiday itself derives from holy day, and these were numerous great feasts like Christmas, Easter, and Whitsun, as well as many saints' days, were mandated days of rest and celebration. These were not just quiet days of prayer. They were vibrant, community-wide festivals. Following the church service, the rest of the day would be given over to feasting, drinking, music, and dancing. People would gather to play games, hold sporting competitions like wrestling and archery, and watch traveling performers, minstrels, and acrobats. These festivals were the glue that bound communities together, a time to release the pressures of daily life and reaffirm social bonds through shared celebration. Even outside of these official holidays, people found time for entertainment. Taverns were central hubs of social life, places for games of dice and chess, for gossip, and for singing. Board games were incredibly popular at all levels of society, and their sense of humor was as lively as our own. We need only look at the literature of the time, such as Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, which is filled with witty observations, slapstick comedy, and body jokes that are still funny centuries later. This appreciation for humor and playfulness can even be found in the most sacred of spaces. The margins of illuminated manuscripts, carefully copied by monks, are often filled with whimsical and bizarre little drawings, known as marginalia, and the intricate wooden carvings on the underside of choir stalls in churches, called misericords, frequently depict comical scenes from everyday life, satirical figures, and mythical beasts. They are a testament to a worldview that could comfortably accommodate both piety and playfulness. To assume that a life of hardship was a life without joy is to fundamentally misunderstand human nature. The people of the Middle Ages, despite facing challenges that are difficult for us to comprehend, were not a grim and miserable monolith. They were fully human, with the same capacity for laughter, love, and celebration that we have today. Their world was not a gray waiting room for the afterlife, but a vibrant and complex stage for the full spectrum of human experience. We have now journeyed through many of the great myths that cloud our vision of the medieval past. We have seen that the world was not flat in their eyes, that their lives were not devoid of cleanliness or flavor, and that their castles and cathedrals were vibrant with color. We have replaced the clumsy, brutish caricatures of knights and Vikings with more complex images of skilled warriors and worldly traders. We have seen that their society, for all its flaws, was governed by more than just superstition and misery. But peeling back these layers of general myth allows us to look more closely at specific stories, to explore the truths behind some of history's most compelling legends. Perhaps no group from the Middle Ages is more legendary or more misunderstood than the Knights Templar. Their very name conjures a world of mystery, of crusader castles, whispered conspiracies, and the search for holy relics. They are a cornerstone of modern myth, often cast as the secret guardians of the Holy Grail, or the shadowy puppet masters of history. But to understand the Templars, we must travel back to their historical beginning, a beginning that was surprisingly humble and born of a pressing, practical need. Our story begins in the Holy Land at the dawn of the 12th century. The First Crusade has been successful, and European Christians now control a narrow strip of territory, including the holy city of Jerusalem. Yet this victory was precarious. For the thousands of pilgrims who now flocked from Europe to visit the sacred sites, the journey was fraught with peril. The roads leading from the coastal ports, like Jaffa inland to Jerusalem, were infested with bandits and raiding parties. For a pilgrim who had risked everything to reach the Holy Land, the final leg of the journey was often the most dangerous. It was in response to this crisis that in the year 1119, a French knight named Hugues de Payens, along with a small group of 8 relatives and acquaintances, made a radical proposal to King Baldwin II of Jerusalem. They proposed the formation of a new kind of order, a community of knights who would take monastic vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, and dedicate their lives and their swords to a single, charitable mission, protecting Christian pilgrims on the roads of the Holy Land. The idea was a revolutionary one. The worlds of the monk and the warrior had always been seen as fundamentally separate, even opposed. A monk's life was one of prayer and contemplation, withdrawn from the world, while a knight's was one of action, violence, and worldly affairs. The concept of a warrior monk was a strange and untested hybrid, yet King Baldwin saw the value in their proposition and granted the fledgling order his full support. He gave them a headquarters in a wing of the Al-Aqsa Mosque on the Temple Mount, a site that the Crusaders believed to be the location of the biblical Temple of Solomon. It was from this holy and prestigious location that the order would take its name. They became the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon, or, more simply, the Knights Templar, for their first decade. The Templars remained a small and relatively obscure order, a handful of knights reliant on donations for their survival. Their emblem depicted 2 knights sharing a single horse, a symbol of their poverty and brotherhood. But their fortunes were about to change dramatically. Their founder, Hugues de Payens, traveled back to Europe to seek official recognition and recruits. There he gained the ear of the most powerful and influential churchmen of the age, Bernard of Clairvaux. Bernard, a charismatic Cistercian abbot, saw in the Templars the ideal of a new and purified knighthood. He became their greatest champion, and thanks to his powerful advocacy, the order was formally recognized by the Pope at the Council of Troyes in 1129. This papal sanction was the moment that transformed the Knights Templar from a small band of pious bodyguards into a major, pan-European institution, poised for an unprecedented rise to power. With the formal backing of the Pope and the powerful endorsement of Bernard of Clairvaux, the Knights Templar were no longer just a small band of pious knights. They were now an official order of the Catholic Church. And this legitimacy opened the floodgates to a level of support, wealth, and influence that their founders could never have imagined. In the decades following the Council of Troyes, the Templars experienced an explosive growth that would transform them into one of the most powerful organizations in the medieval world. A crucial step in this transformation came in 1139 with the papal bull known as Omni Datum Optimum, issued by Pope Innocent II. This document granted the Templars a series of unprecedented privileges that set them apart from almost every other institution. They were given the right to build their own churches and chapels, to have their own priests who were not under the authority of local bishops, and to bury their dead in their own consecrated ground. They were also exempted from paying the tithe, the standard 10% tax that all other church lands were subject to. Most importantly, this papal bull declared that the Templar order was subject to no authority on earth save that of the Pope himself. This single decree made them a truly international and autonomous power. A local king, prince, or bishop could not command them, tax them, or seize their lands. They were a sovereign entity within every kingdom, a supranational corporation whose CEO was the Pope. This independence made them incredibly effective, but it would also, in time, breed suspicion and resentment. Armed with this papal protection and a mission that captured the imagination of a pious age, donations poured in from every corner of Christendom. Nobles who were too old or otherwise unable to go on crusade themselves sought to gain spiritual merit by supporting those who did. They bequeathed vast estates to the Templars, farms, manors, vineyards, mills, and even entire villages. Younger sons of noble families, with no land to inherit, flocked to join the order, bringing with them their horses, their armor, and often a significant portion of their family's wealth. This rapid accumulation of property, all across Europe and the Holy Land, presented the Templars with a significant logistical challenge, and their solution was ingenious. To manage their far-flung assets, they established a network of local headquarters, known as commanderies. It was this network that allowed them to pioneer a system that was, in essence, the birth of international banking. The system was born of the same need that had created the order in the first place: the safety of travelers. A noble planning a pilgrimage to Jerusalem would face the dangerous task of transporting a vast amount of gold to fund his journey. Instead, he could deposit his gold at the Templar commandery in London or Paris. In return, he would receive a coded letter of credit. Upon arriving in the Holy Land, he could present this letter at the Templar headquarters in Jerusalem and withdraw the equivalent sum. The Templars, with their network of fortified commanderies and their reputation for incorruptibility, were the only institution with the security and trust to make such a system work. They had effectively invented the traveler's check, and in doing so, they became the bankers to Christendom's nobility. Yet, even as they became powerful financiers, they never abandoned their founding purpose. In the Holy Land, they were the elite fighting force of the Crusader states, highly trained, heavily armed, and bound by a strict code of discipline that forbade retreat unless vastly outnumbered. The Templar Knights were the shock troops of every major Christian army, renowned and feared for their fanatical courage on the battlefield. By the 13th century, the Knights Templar had reached the zenith of their power, evolving from a humble band of pilgrim bodyguards into a vast and influential institution that straddled the worlds of finance, religion, and warfare. But what was life actually like for the men who joined this powerful and demanding order? To be a Templar was to submit to a life of extreme discipline and austerity, a life governed by a strict code of conduct designed to forge the perfect warrior monk. The rule of the order, which was based on the teachings of Bernard of Clairvaux, dictated every aspect of a brother's existence, beyond the primary vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. There were hundreds of regulations governing daily life. A Templar owned nothing personally, not even his own armor and horse, which belonged to the order. They ate their meals in communal silence, listening to readings from the scripture. To foster a sense of humility, they often ate 2 nights to a bowl. Their diet was simple, and meat was forbidden on most days of the week. Their iconic dress was also a symbol of their vows. The elite Knight brothers wore a simple white mantle, symbolizing purity, emblazoned with a red cross. The sergeants, who were of now noble birth, all forms of vanity and worldly entertainment were strictly forbidden. They could not hunt for sport, attend tournaments, or listen to secular music. Their lives were a relentless cycle of prayer, interspersed with rigorous weapons training and the duties of managing their vast estates. It was the life of a monk, but the monastery was a military barracks, and the purpose of their piety was to create fearless, focused soldiers for Christ. At its height, the order was a kingdom unto itself. It commanded a massive fleet of ships, owned huge swaths of land in every country in Europe, and, for a time, even owned the entire island of Cyprus. The Templar commanderies in London and Paris served as the unofficial treasuries for the English and French monarchies. Kings and popes used the Templars as their trusted financial agents, diplomats, and advisors. The Grand Master of the Temple was a figure of immense international importance, consulted on matters of war and state by the crowned heads of Europe. In the Holy Land, they were the backbone of the Christian defense. They garrisoned a string of the most formidable castles ever built, fortresses like Chastel Blanc and Tortosa, which were masterworks of military engineering. In battle, they were a terrifying force, but their power and autonomy could also be a source of friction, as they sometimes pursued their own policies, independent of the local Crusader kings. But the very foundation of this immense power was their sacred mission, the defense of the Holy Land, and in 1291 that foundation crumbled. In that year, the city of Acre, the last major Crusader stronghold on the mainland, fell to the Mamluk Sultanate. The Christian presence in the Holy Land, which the Templars had been created to protect, was effectively extinguished. The warrior monks were forced to evacuate, first to Cyprus, and then back to their commanderies in Europe. This created a sudden and profound crisis for the order. They were now a massive, standing international army, immensely wealthy and privileged, with no active war to fight. their original purpose had vanished. Back in Europe, their autonomy, their secrecy, and their vast, untaxed wealth began to look less like a holy necessity and more like a threat. The suspicion and jealousy that had simmered for decades now had room to grow. The Templars had become a powerful organization without a clear purpose, making them dangerously vulnerable. The Knights Templar, adrift without their sacred mission in the Holy Land, had become an anomaly, a powerful, wealthy, and autonomous institution that no longer fit neatly into the changing landscape of Europe. Their vulnerability did not go unnoticed, particularly by one of the most powerful and ruthless monarchs of the age, King Philip IV of France, known as Philip the Fair on account of his handsome features. His nature was anything but. He was a cold, calculating, and deeply ambitious ruler, driven by a vision of a powerful, centralized French monarchy. And he was perpetually in need of money. Philip's costly wars against England and Flanders had left the French crown deeply in debt. He had already debased the kingdom's coinage and had previously targeted other wealthy groups within his borders, expelling the Jews and the Lombard bankers to seize their assets. Now his gaze fell upon the Knights Templar. Their vast network of commanderies, their immense treasury, and their untaxed lands represented a source of wealth that could solve all his financial problems. But the Templars were not a simple group of merchants. They were a holy order, protected by the Pope. A direct assault was unthinkable. To move against them, Philip needed to destroy their reputation first. He needed to strip them of their holy mantle and recast them as heretics and monsters. Aided by his ruthless chief minister, Guillaume de Nogaret, Philip began to orchestrate a masterful and vicious smear campaign. His agents sought out disgruntled or expelled former Templars, offering them pardons and rewards in exchange for testimony from these unreliable witnesses. They carefully constructed a list of accusations, each one more shocking and scandalous than the last. The charges were designed to provoke maximum horror and outrage. The Templars were accused of heresy, of forcing new recruits to deny Jesus Christ and to spit upon the crucifix during their secret initiation ceremonies. They were accused of idolatry, of worshipping a mysterious bearded head known as Baphomet. And they were accused of institutionalized sacrilege and debauchery. These accusations were a potent weapon, intended to poison public opinion and, most importantly, to pressure a weak and embattled pope into withdrawing his protection. With his narrative prepared, Philip planned his strike with devastating precision. In the autumn of 1307, he sent out sealed orders to his royal officials in every district of France. These orders were to remain sealed until the appointed day, to be opened and acted upon simultaneously at dawn. The element of complete surprise was essential. That day was Friday, the 13th of October, 1307. In a massive, coordinated police action, the king's men struck all across the kingdom. They stormed the Templar commanderies, arresting every brother they could find, from the humblest sergeant to the highest-ranking knights. The Grand Master himself, Jacques de Molay, was taken into custody in Paris in a single morning. The French branch of the most powerful military order in Christendom was shattered and imprisoned. The origin of the unlucky superstition surrounding Friday the 13th is often traced back to this very day. The Templars, who for 2 centuries had faced down armies in the Holy Land, were caught completely off guard. They had not been defeated on the battlefield, but had been ensnared in a web of political intrigue. Now, in the dungeons of their own king. The next phase of their destruction was about to begin. To force them, by any means necessary, to confess to the monstrous crimes they were accused of. With the Templars imprisoned and the element of surprise having succeeded, King Philip's plan entered its second and most brutal phase. To legitimize his actions and secure the condemnation of the order, he needed confessions. The charges of heresy and blasphemy were so extreme that they would be difficult to believe without the knights themselves admitting to them. To this end, Philip handed the captive Templars over to the medieval Inquisition, an institution he knew he could bend to his will. In the dark dungeons of Paris and across France, the royal officials and inquisitors went to work. The knights, who had been trained for the open combat of the battlefield, were now subjected to a different kind of warfare, a systematic and soul-crushing campaign of psychological and physical torture. The methods used were designed to break the will of the strongest men. Knights were stretched on the rack, their limbs pulled from their sockets. They were subjected to the strappedo, hoisted into the air by their wrists, which had been tied behind their backs. Their feet were coated in oil and held over fire. The goal was not to discover the truth, but to force them to repeat the confessions that had already been written for them. Under such relentless agony, it was inevitable that most would break. One by one, knights confessed to the list of impossible crimes. They admitted to spitting on the cross. They admitted to denying their Savior. They admitted to worshipping an idol named Baphomet. The Grand Master himself, Jacques de Molay, after enduring immense suffering, also confessed. The warrior monks, famed for their courage, were reduced to broken men, willing to say anything to make the pain stop. These confessions were a stunning victory for Philip. He immediately publicized them, sending copies to the other kings of Europe and to the papal court. The news that the Templars, and even their own Grand Master, had admitted to heresy sent a shockwave across Christendom. It placed the Pope, Clement V, in an extraordinarily difficult position. Clement, a Frenchman who was heavily influenced by the French crown, was initially furious at Philip's unilateral move against a papal order. But faced with a mountain of signed confessions, he was politically cornered. The Pope attempted to seize control of the process, convening his own papal commissions to investigate the matter, and for a brief moment it seemed the truth might prevail. When dozens of Templars were brought before the Pope's representatives, away from the immediate threat of the king's torturers, they found their courage once more. A significant number of knights, including high-ranking officials, bravely retracted their earlier statements. They testified that their confessions had been lies, forced from them under unbearable torture, and they proclaimed the absolute innocence of their order. This act of defiance was a direct challenge to King Philip's entire case, and his response was swift and merciless, declaring that any knight who retracted his confession was a relapsed heretic. Philip bypassed the papal commission entirely. On a single day in May of 1310, 54 Knights Templar, who had recanted their testimony, were taken to a field outside Paris and publicly burned at the stake. The message sent by these executions was terrifyingly clear. To defend the order was to be sentenced to death by fire. This brutal act of state terror effectively silenced any further organized defense. The remaining knights were terrified into submission, and the Pope was shown in no uncertain terms that the King of France would stop at nothing to achieve his goal. The fate of the Knights Templar was now all but sealed. with the Templars' defense brutally silenced by the fires in Paris. The fate of the order was now in the hands of Pope Clement V. King Philip had demonstrated his utter ruthlessness, and the Pope, a man caught between the demands of justice and the pressures of a powerful monarch, was forced to find a final solution. To this end, he convened a great church council in the city of Vienne in southern France. In the year 1312, the official purpose of the council was to deliberate on the evidence and deliver a final verdict on the Knights Templar. But the council was far from a neutral and impartial gathering. The Pope was in a deeply compromised position. The evidence gathered by his own papal agents in kingdoms outside of France, such as in Spain and Italy, had largely exonerated the local Templars, finding no proof of systemic heresy. Many of the cardinals and bishops gathered at Vienne were deeply skeptical of the charges, recognizing that the confessions from France were tainted by the use of torture. There was a genuine reluctance to condemn an entire holy order that had shed so much blood for Christendom. King Philip, however, was not about to let his prize slip away. He preempted any meaningful debate by marching to Vienne himself, accompanied by a large military force. His presence was an unspoken but crystal-clear threat to the Pope and the assembled clergy. He had not gone to all this trouble to see the Templars acquitted. He demanded their total and immediate suppression, and his army was there to ensure he got it. Cornered and intimidated, Pope Clement devised a political solution to a problem that had no just legal answer. He could not declare the Templars guilty, as the evidence was too weak and the injustice too plain. But he dared not declare them innocent, for that would mean open conflict with the French crown. So he chose a third path. On the 22nd of March, 1312, Clement issued a papal bull titled Vox in Excelso. In this decree, he carefully stated that although the order had not been formally found guilty of heresy, due to the grave scandal that had arisen and the damage to the Church's reputation, he was suppressing the order by administrative action for the good of Christendom. It was a masterclass in political maneuvering. The order of the Knights Templar was not condemned, but it was abolished. It ceased to exist with the stroke of a pen. The most powerful military order in the world was dissolved forever. Their crime was not heresy, but the fact that they had become too powerful, too wealthy, and had stood in the way of an ambitious king. The papal bull also decreed that the Templars' vast wealth and property should be transferred to their great rivals, the other major military order, the Knights Hospitaller. In practice, however, this transfer was far from complete. Philip of France, as well as other monarchs like Edward II of England, claimed enormous sums from the Templar accounts to cover the fraudulent costs of the trials. Philip had achieved his primary objective, the financial ruin of the Templars and the enrichment of his own treasury. But the story had one final tragic act left to play. For 7 years, the highest leaders of the order, including the Grand Master Jacques de Malle, had languished in a royal prison. In March of 1314, they were brought out onto a scaffold erected in front of the Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris to hear their final sentence, life in perpetual imprisonment. It was here, after years of silence and submission, that the old Grand Master made his last stand. In a final, desperate act of defiance, he is said to have found his voice and his courage, and loudly proclaimed the innocence of his beloved order for all the world to hear. Jacques Desmalet's final, thundering proclamation of innocence in the heart of Paris was an act of incredible courage, but it was also a death sentence. King Philip the Fair, whose entire justification for destroying the order rested upon the supposed confessions of its leaders, was incandescent with fury. This public retraction undermined years of his careful, ruthless planning. He was not about to let such a defiant challenge go unanswered. Acting immediately and without any further consultation with the Church, the king pronounced his own verdict. As relapsed heretics, Jacques de Malle and his companion in defiance, Geoffrey de Charny, were to be put to death. That very same evening, on the 18th of March, 1314, they were taken to a small island in the middle of the river Seine. There, with the towers of Notre Dame and the walls of the royal palace in view, a pyre had been constructed. The two old knights, who had dedicated their lives to the defense of Christendom, were to be burned at the stake. The chroniclers of the time, even those hostile to the order, recorded the extraordinary courage with which the two men met their fate. They refused to have their eyes covered and asked to be turned to face the Cathedral of Notre Dame, holding their hands together in prayer. They maintained their innocence to the very end, proclaiming that the order was holy and just, and that they were dying as martyrs. The dignity and fortitude they displayed reportedly left the crowd of Parisian onlookers stunned and deeply moved. It is here, in the smoke and flames of the pyre, that history gives way to one of its most enduring legends. It is said that, as the fire consumed him, Jacques de Malle uttered a final, terrible curse with his last breath. He summoned his persecutors to meet him at the final judgment. He called upon Pope Clement and King Philip to appear before God's tribunal within the year to answer for their crimes against his order. Whether or not the words were actually spoken, what happened next was uncanny. The curse, or prophecy, was fulfilled with astonishing speed. Pope Clement V, who had been suffering from an illness, died just 1 month later in April. King Philip the Fair, still in his prime, suffered a stroke while on a hunting trip and died in November of that same year. Both men were dead before the year was out. To a deeply religious and superstitious public, this was no coincidence. It was a clear and terrifying sign of God's wrath, and it forever cemented the legend of the martyred Templars and their Grand Master's curse. With the order officially dissolved and its leaders executed, what became of the thousands of other Templars? Their fate varied. In France, those who had confessed and remained silent were quietly absorbed into other monastic orders or given small pensions. In other parts of Europe, the suppression was handled less brutally. In Portugal, the king simply rebranded the order, which became the Order of Christ, and continued its mission of fighting for the faith. The men survived, but the institution was dead. The sudden and violent destruction of such a powerful and secretive organization, based on charges that many believed to be false, created a void that was destined to be filled by myth. The idea that the Templars had been destroyed to hide a secret, that they had possessed a great treasure or some forbidden knowledge, took root almost immediately. Their tragic and unjust end guaranteed their immortality, ensuring they would transition from being a historical institution into the subject of endless legend and conspiracy. The dramatic fall of the Knights Templar is a story that lies at the heart of the European medieval experience. It is a tale of faith, power, and betrayal that has echoed through the centuries. But the medieval world was far larger than the kingdoms of Christendom. While popes and kings vied for power in the West, a different kind of empire was reaching its zenith in the East, an empire that would dwarf all others and fundamentally reshape the course of global history. This was the empire of the Mongols. Our popular image of the Mongols is often as one-dimensional as that of the Vikings, a terrifying, unstoppable horde, thundering out of the steppes on horseback, leaving nothing but destruction in its wake. And while their conquests were indeed swift, brutal, and vast, to see them only as destroyers is to miss the complexity of the society they built. To understand this other side of the Mongol world, we will not look at their famous conquests, but at a more intimate and revealing aspect of their culture, the sacred and unshakable tradition of hospitality. On the vast, unforgiving expanse of the Eurasian steppe, where settlements were few and far between and the elements could be lethal, hospitality was not merely a social grace, it was a fundamental law of survival. A lone traveler, a merchant, or a messenger was entirely dependent on the kindness of strangers. To refuse shelter or food to someone in need was tantamount to a death sentence, and Mongol culture treated it as a grave crime, an offense against the entire community and the natural order of the world. This obligation was more than just practical. It was a sacred duty, deeply embedded in their spiritual beliefs. Hospitality was an offering made to Tengri, the eternal blue sky, the highest deity in their shamanistic faith. To welcome a guest, even an enemy, was to honor Tengri and to maintain balance in the world. To deny a guest was to risk divine punishment and to bring shame upon oneself and one's family. Every ger or yurt, no matter how humble, was a potential sanctuary. The rituals of this hospitality were ancient and strictly observed. A traveler approaching a camp would dismount from their horse at a respectful distance, leaving their primary weapons, like their bow, with their mount as a sign of peaceful intent. The host, upon seeing the traveler, was obligated to invite them in. Once inside the ger, the guest was offered a seat of honor, and the first and most important ritual would begin: the presentation of a bowl of arag, the fermented and slightly alcoholic mare's milk that was the staple drink of the steppes. This offering of arag was the universal symbol of peace and welcome. For the guest to accept and drink from the bowl was to accept the host's protection and to enter into a temporary truce. To refuse the offered drink was a profound insult, a rejection of the host's goodwill that could have serious consequences. Once this ritual was complete, the guest was considered to be under the host's absolute protection. Sharing a larger meal, particularly the meat of a sheep slaughtered in the guest's honor, would further solidify this bond. The act of eating together, of sharing salt and sustenance, was a form of temporary treaty for the duration of their stay. The guest was to be protected with the host's own life if necessary. This single, powerful tradition reveals a side of Mongol culture often lost in the stories of their conquests, a society bound by sacred laws, mutual obligation, and a profound understanding of what it took to survive and build a community in one of the world's most challenging environments. This sacred tradition of hospitality, born from the harsh realities of the steppe, was not left as a mere unwritten custom. Under the leadership of Genghis Khan and his successors, it was transformed into a cornerstone of imperial policy. The Mongol Empire, the largest contiguous land empire in human history, was a mosaic of different peoples, cultures, and religions to govern this vast and diverse domain. The Khans understood that they needed more than just military might. They needed to facilitate communication and commerce on an unprecedented scale. The Great Khan's law code, known as the Yasa, formalized many of the ancient traditions of the steppes. It is said to have contained strict decrees mandating the safety of travelers, particularly official envoys and merchants. An attack on a diplomat or a merchant was considered a direct attack on the authority of the Khan himself and was punishable by death. This imperial guarantee of safe passage was a revolutionary concept, and it was the key to unlocking the economic potential of their enormous empire. To enforce this policy and to knit their empire together, the Mongols established a breathtakingly efficient communication and supply network known as the Yam. This system was essentially an imperial postal service, but it was far more than that. It consisted of a chain of well-provisioned relay stations, or post houses, situated roughly a day's ride apart along all the major trade routes. Any traveler on official business, carrying a special passport or tablet of authority known as a peza, was considered a guest of the Khan. Upon presenting their peza at a Yam station, a traveler was entitled to fresh horses, food, and safe lodging for the night, all at the expense of the state. This system allowed official messengers to travel at astonishing speeds, covering up to 200 miles in a single day, swapping out tired horses for fresh ones at each station. For merchants, it meant they could travel with smaller entourages, secure in the knowledge that they would have supplies and protection along their entire route. It was the logistical engine that made the empire run. Foreign travelers who witnessed the Yam in action were astounded by its scale and efficiency. The Venetian merchant Marco Polo wrote of it with unconcealed admiration, describing how the Great Khan had stations with hundreds of horses at the ready, allowing his messengers to gallop across the continent. Nothing like it existed in Europe at the time, where travel was slow, dangerous, and unpredictable. The Yam was the physical embodiment of the Mongol policy of state-sponsored hospitality. This commitment to protecting travelers and facilitating trade was the foundation of the era known as the Pax Mongolica, or the Mongol Peace, for roughly a century. The Mongols' unified and iron-fisted rule created a period of relative stability across the vast Eurasian landmass. For the first time since the Roman Empire, the ancient Silk Road was united under a single authority. A merchant could now travel from the shores of the Black Sea to the gates of Beijing with a degree of safety that had been unthinkable for centuries. This security unleashed an incredible flow of goods, ideas, and technologies between East and West. Gunpowder, paper money, the compass, and printing techniques all traveled westward along these Mongol-protected routes. It was said that a maiden carrying a sack of gold could walk from one end of the empire to the other without fear of being molested, while likely an exaggeration. This proverb captures the essence of what the Mongols achieved. Their ancient custom of hospitality, scaled up to an imperial level, had effectively created the first truly interconnected world. The Mongol peace, born of a sacred tradition of hospitality, reveals a medieval world far more interconnected than is commonly believed. A world where ideas and goods flowed across continents. Now, for our final story, we will travel back along those trade routes, leaving the vast plains of the East and returning to the heart of feudal Europe. We will journey back to a world of castles, knights, and courtly intrigue, to meet a figure who defies one of the last great myths we have yet to explore. The myth of the passive and powerless medieval woman. History often presents high-born women of the Middle Ages as little more than political pawns, their value measured in the lands and alliances their marriages could secure. While this was certainly a reality for many, it is not the whole story. Some women, through a combination of inheritance, intelligence, and indomitable will, not only navigated this treacherous world, but came to dominate it. And no one exemplifies this more than the remarkable Eleanor, Duchess of Aquitaine, Queen of France, and later, Queen of England. Eleanor's story is one of such epic scope that it feels like a work of fiction. She lived for over 80 years, outlasting most of her contemporaries, and was a central player in the politics of Western Europe for more than 6 decades. She was the wife of 2 kings and the mother of 2 more, including perhaps the most famous medieval monarch of all, Richard the Lionheart. She was a patron of the arts, a crusader, a political prisoner, and a ruler in her own right, a woman of immense power in a world overwhelmingly dominated by men. Her extraordinary career began with an extraordinary inheritance. In 1137, at the age of just 15, her father, the Duke of Aquitaine, died. In an era where titles almost always passed to a male heir, Eleanor inherited his domain. She was now the Duchess of Aquitaine and Countess of Poitou, the ruler of a vast and wealthy territory that stretched across nearly a quarter of modern-day France. Her lands were richer, larger, and more culturally vibrant than the personal domains of the King of France himself. She was, overnight, the most eligible bride in all of Europe, seeking to protect his daughter and his lands. Her father's dying wish was that she be married to the heir to the French throne, Prince Louis. Within weeks of her father's death, the wedding took place, and shortly after, the old king died. At 15, Eleanor was now the Queen of France. Her arrival in Paris was a culture shock, both for her and for the French court. The court of Aquitaine was famous for its poetry, its music, and its liberal attitudes, the very birthplace of the courtly love tradition. The Parisian court of her husband, the pious and austere Louis VII, was grim and monastic by comparison. The vibrant, intelligent, and headstrong young queen was a poor match for her solemn king. Their incompatibility was cast into the global spotlight when Eleanor made the unprecedented decision to accompany her husband on the Second Crusade. This was not the act of a dutiful wife. It was the act of a feudal ruler. She joined the expedition as the Duchess of Aquitaine, leading her own vassals to the Holy Land. The journey was a military disaster, and it was a personal disaster for their marriage. Rumors of her scandalous behavior, particularly her close relationship with her uncle, Raymond, the Prince of Antioch, enraged Louis and damaged their union beyond repair. They returned to Europe in failure, their marriage a hollow shell. Eleanor, one of the most brilliant and energetic women of her age, found herself bound to a man she considered to be more of a monk than a king. She was a queen, but she was trapped. This, however, was not the end of her story. It was merely the end of its first chapter. Eleanor was not a woman to accept a life of quiet frustration, and she would soon make a move that would upend the politics of Europe and set her on the path to an even greater destiny. Eleanor of Aquitaine's story was far from over. In a stunning and audacious move for a 12th century woman, she actively sought and obtained an annulment from her marriage to the King of France in the spring of 1152. On the grounds of being too closely related, their union was dissolved. Eleanor was once again the independent ruler of her vast domains, and at 30 years old, she was once again the most powerful and desirable bachelorette in Europe. She would not remain so for long. Just 8 weeks after leaving the French throne, in a decision that was both a political masterstroke and a genuine love match, she married the young, energetic, and ferociously ambitious Duke of Normandy, Henry Plantagenet. This marriage was a political earthquake. 2 years later, in 1154, Henry ascended to the English throne as King Henry II. Eleanor, the former Queen of France, was now crowned Queen of England by joining her immense inheritance of Aquitaine with Henry's lands in England and northern France. They forged the Angevin Empire, a sprawling domain that dwarfed the lands of her former husband. Her second marriage was as tempestuous and passionate as her first had been cold and sterile. With Henry, she had a brood of children, including 4 sons who would grow up to shake the world, among them Richard, the future Lionheart, and John, who would one day be forced to sign the Magna Carta. But the marriage of these 2 powerful, ambitious people was destined for conflict. As her sons grew older and chafed under their father's authoritarian rule, Eleanor took their side. In 1173, she joined them in a great revolt against Henry. The rebellion failed, and for her defiance, Eleanor was captured by her husband and placed under house arrest, where she would remain a political prisoner for 16 long years. Yet, even in captivity, her spirit was not broken. Her true moment of ultimate power came after Henry's death in 1189, released from her prison by her favorite son, now King Richard, the Lionheart. Eleanor, now in her late 60s, effectively became the ruler of England. She governed the Angevin Empire as regent, while Richard was away on the Third Crusade, skillfully managing the realm and putting down the rebellions of her youngest son, John. When Richard was captured and held for ransom on his return journey, it was Eleanor who traversed the empire, raising the astronomical sum of money required to buy his freedom. Even after Richard's death, she continued to be a pivotal force, securing the throne for John and, in her late 70s, undertaking a perilous diplomatic journey across the Pyrenees to fetch a bride for the French prince. She was a stateswoman, a diplomat, a patron of the arts, and a queen twice over, a woman who shaped the destiny of nations. She died in 1204 at the age of 82, a true titan of the medieval age. Eleanor's incredible life serves as a final, powerful reminder of our journey's central theme. We began by chipping away at the simple, dark myths of the medieval world, and underneath, we have found a reality that is infinitely more complex and fascinating. We found a world that was not intellectually dark, but one that invented the university. We found people who were not just dirty and miserable, but who valued cleanliness, flavor, and joyous celebration. We have met pious warrior monks, globe-spanning merchants, and queens who ruled empires. The past, when we look closely, is never as simple as the stories we tell about it. It is not a monolithic age of darkness, but 1,000 years of human experience, filled with the same struggles, triumphs, and contradictions that define our own time. The quiet, often overlooked details of this history are where the real stories lie. If you have enjoyed this calm exploration of the medieval world and wish to journey with us again, please consider subscribing to Medieval Nocturnes. Thank you for listening. Until next time, may your rest be peaceful.